Christopher Cross has been riding high for years, until this year, when COVID-19 brought him.
Christopher Cross didn't just fade away, he was erased. In 1981, he swept the Grammys and sat at the very top of the music world. Then, almost overnight, he vanished. Most people think fans simply moved on, but the official story is a lie. He didn't lose his talent, and he didn't stop writing hits. A silent decision made behind closed doors systematically wiped him from the industry. This isn't just the story of a fading star. It's the story of a corporate hit job. The night the nobody stole the Grammys. Back in the 1980s, Christopher Cross wasn't just a songwriter. He was one of the biggest artists in the world. His songs weren't only climbing the charts, they became part of people's everyday lives. What made his success even more special was that he didn't become famous by trying to stand out. He simply wrote great songs, and people loved them. But if there was one night that showed just how big Christopher Cross had become, it was the 1981 Grammy Awards. You see, when Christopher arrived at the 1981 Grammy Awards, very few people expected him to dominate the biggest night in music. After all, he was up against some of the most famous names in the industry. But as the winners were announced, something unbelievable started happening. Christopher Cross kept hearing his name over and over again. By the end of the night, he had won 5 Grammy Awards, including the 4 biggest awards of the night: Album of the Year, Record of the Year, Song of the Year, and Best New Artist. No artist had ever pulled off this sweep before. An unknown musician from Texas had just made Grammy history. For a lot of fans, it was proof that as long as you had real talent, you could make it to the very top. After this night, it looked like he was living every musician's dream. His records were selling by the millions. Radio stations couldn't stop playing his songs, record executives couldn't stop celebrating, and fans couldn't wait to hear what he would release next. From the outside, it honestly looked like Christopher Cross had reached a point where nothing could stop him. And this is exactly why what happened next makes no sense. Christopher didn't simply retire, nor did fans simply grow tired of his songs. Instead, he seemed to vanish almost overnight. One year, he was breaking historic music records, and just a few years later, it was like the industry was trying to pretend he never existed. He largely disappeared from television, was pulled from the radio, and pushed out of the spotlight. What happened to him wasn't just a case of music styles changing. It was a brutal reminder of how cold the music business can be. His disappearance remains one of the saddest downfalls in music history. The story of a guy who was handed the world, only to have it pulled out from under him behind closed doors. So how does someone go from winning the biggest awards in music to almost being forgotten just a few years later? The Texas guitar hero hidden behind a flamingo. If you picked Christopher's album, there was one unusual detail that most people never paid attention to. On his 1979 debut album, Christopher Cross, you would not find his face anywhere on the cover. There was no portrait, no fancy photo, and nothing to introduce the man behind the music. Instead, there was only a painting of a flamingo. Now, most fans probably assumed it was simply part of the album's artwork. But there was a much more personal reason behind it. Christopher was a very shy person, and he never felt comfortable with the way he looked. So, instead of putting himself on the cover, he chose to let the music speak for itself. Long before the Grammys and the platinum records, he was simply Christopher Geppert, a young musician from San Antonio, Texas, trying to make a living through music. He grew up in a modest family. His father was an army doctor, and money was often tight. When Christopher was 15 years old, his parents made a sacrifice to buy him a Gibson acoustic guitar for $300, paying for it in monthly installments because they simply could not afford it all at once. Interestingly, this guitar would change the direction of his life. By the time he reached his 20s, Christopher was playing with a local cover band called Flash. Life as a musician was anything but glamorous. The band traveled across Texas, performing in dive bars, bowling alleys, and honky-tonks. They played 4 long sets almost every night, sometimes until 2 o'clock in the morning, earning around $40 and a few free drinks for all their hard work. It was exhausting, but every performance made Christopher a better musician. Now, because Christopher Cross later became known for smooth songs like Sailing, a lot of people assumed he was just a soft rock singer who played a little guitar on the side. But the musicians who knew him back in Texas would probably disagree. They knew he was an incredible guitarist. In fact, there's a story that surprises a lot of people. Back in 1970, when Deep Purple came to San Antonio, their legendary guitarist Ritchie Blackmore became ill before the show. Christopher, who was only 19 at the time, was reportedly asked to fill in on guitar. An unknown local musician suddenly found himself playing with one of the biggest rock bands in the world. Whether you knew his name or not, moments like that showed just how respected his guitar skills already were. So how did someone with this kind of rock guitar talent end up becoming famous for gentle songs instead? Well, while the rest of his band focused on loud rock music, Christopher was hearing something completely different in his mind. He imagined smooth harmonies, rich string arrangements, and jazz-inspired chords. During long drives between Houston and San Antonio, he found himself quietly humming a melody about escaping the pressure and noise of everyday life. This melody eventually became Sailing. When producer Michael Omartian listened to Christopher's demo in Los Angeles, he immediately realized he was listening to something special. Warner Brothers gave the project a modest recording budget of around $200,000, and the album was recorded at Pecan Street Studio. But when it came time to design the album cover, Christopher refused to pose for a photograph. He worried that people would judge his weight and his thinning hair before they ever listened to his music. In the end, the record label decided not to argue because the songs were simply too good. Radio stations embraced them almost immediately. The album sold millions of copies. And as long as the music kept making money, nobody seemed to care that the man behind the hits was hiding behind a flamingo. But hiding behind a painted bird worked perfectly, at least for a while. Then, almost overnight, the one thing meant to protect him became the one thing he could no longer hide behind. The day music got eyes. In 1981, just 6 months after Christopher Cross made Grammy history, a brand new cable channel called MTV went on the air. At first, it looked like just another television station, but before long, it completely changed the music business. Almost overnight, the rules that had made artists famous for decades were rewritten. You see, before MTV, music was all about what people heard. Radio was king, and this gave every artist a fair chance. If your songs were good, radio stations played them. If listeners loved what they heard, they bought your records. It didn't matter if you were young or old, handsome or ordinary, outgoing or shy. Most fans had never even seen their favorite singers. They simply imagined what those artists looked like while listening at home or driving in their cars. But MTV changed all of that. Suddenly, listening to the music was no longer enough. Now people wanted to watch it too. Record labels quickly realized that having a great voice was only part of the job. Artists also needed a memorable look, exciting music videos, and a personality that could grab people's attention the moment they appeared on screen. Take a look at the stars who quickly became the faces of MTV. The likes of Michael Jackson amazed audiences with videos that felt like short movies rather than performances. Madonna constantly reinvented her image and wasn't afraid to push boundaries. Prince stood out with his bold fashion and unforgettable performances, while bands like Duran Duran filmed glamorous videos in fancy locations that made every song feel like an adventure. Before long, it was clear that the music industry wasn't just selling songs anymore, it was also selling an image. And this image was becoming just as important as the music itself. Christopher Cross couldn't have been more different. He was in his early 30s, balding, soft-spoken, and carried himself like an ordinary person. He didn't look like a rock star, and he wasn't trying to be one. He looked like someone you might meet at the grocery store, work with in an office, or see teaching at a local school. During the radio era, none of these mattered because people judged him by his music. But in the MTV era, many executives suddenly saw those same qualities as a problem. All of a sudden, labels wanted artists who looked exciting on TV and could keep young viewers glued to the screen. Christopher Cross had built his career in a world where great songwriting and beautiful recordings were enough. Now, he was trying to succeed in a business that cared just as much about appearance as talent. Christopher's record label knew they couldn't pretend nothing had changed. MTV was quickly becoming one of the biggest forces in the music industry, and if they wanted to keep him at the top, they had to adapt. So they started producing music videos for his new songs. But as filming began, it didn't take long to realize there was a problem. Christopher was never comfortable in front of the camera, and his quiet, down-to-earth personality didn't fit MTV's flashy style. The game had changed, and looks were suddenly just as important as talent. Panicking, his record label took a gamble they believed would solve the problem. Instead, the plan backfired in ways no one expected. Hiding the star in his own music video and the secret corporate blacklist. By the time Christopher Cross was preparing to release his second album, Another Page, in 1983, the music business had changed. If your music video wasn't getting played, millions of young fans might never hear your songs. His label knew this, so they invested heavily in videos for singles like Think of Laura, All Right, and No Time for Talk. But they faced a strange problem. Christopher Cross had become one of the biggest names in music, yet the people promoting him seemed reluctant to put him in front of the camera. Instead of making him the focus, his videos featured beaches, sailboats, crashing waves, flowing curtains, and attractive models. Christopher appeared only briefly before the camera shifted away again. It almost seemed as if the label was trying to hide the very person whose voice audiences loved. That strategy couldn't last forever. Eventually, Christopher appeared on television, and people finally saw the man behind the voice. But instead of talking about his music, many focused on his appearance. Christopher was quiet, balding, and looked more like an ordinary man than the glamorous pop stars beginning to dominate MTV. Sadly, that was enough to make him an easy target. Radio hosts, comedians, and late-night television shows joked about the way he looked. Before long, one of the biggest Grammy winners in history was receiving more attention for his appearance than for the music that had made him famous. The impact soon showed in the sales figures. Another Page gave fans memorable songs, and Think of Laura became even more popular after appearing on the television drama General Hospital. Even so, the album couldn't match the success of his debut. His first album sold more than 5 million copies in the United States, while Another Page sold fewer than 1 million. For most artists, that would have been a huge achievement. But after the extraordinary success of his debut, many in the industry viewed it as a disappointment. and their attitude toward Christopher began to change. Concert promoters started moving him from large arenas into smaller theaters, and some shows were canceled because ticket sales slowed. At first, it seemed Christopher had simply fallen out of fashion. The music industry was changing rapidly, with new stars appearing almost every month. But many people began asking the same question. Was it really just bad timing, or had the industry quietly decided to move on? No one at MTV ever publicly announced that Christopher Cross was unwelcome. There was never an official statement saying his music was being pushed aside. Yet many people inside the industry believed something had changed. His videos, which should have benefited from his Grammy success, became harder to find. Instead of airing during the day, they were often shown late at night when few viewers were watching. Years later, reports about comments from a former MTV programmer gave fans another reason to wonder. According to those reports, he said MTV believed viewers wanted artists they either wanted to be or wanted to date, and Christopher Cross didn't fit either image. Whether that reflected the views of the entire network or not, many fans have pointed to those remarks as a possible explanation for why one of music's biggest stars disappeared from television so quickly. Whether that was the full story or not, the damage was real. As his videos disappeared from television, radio stations became less interested in his new songs, record stores ordered fewer albums, and the momentum that had made him one of America's biggest stars steadily faded. The decline also affected Christopher's finances. Although his music had earned millions through hit albums and the Oscar-winning Arthur's Theme, successful record sales did not always mean artists kept most of the profits. As sales slowed, his royalty checks shrank, while his expenses remained the same. Eventually, the financial pressure became so great that he had to sell his home in Austin. Despite all this, his record label wasn't ready to give up. In 1985, Warner Brothers invested heavily in his third album, Every Turn of the World, hoping a new sound would revive his career. But the comeback never came. The album failed to connect with listeners, and it became clear Christopher Cross was no longer the artist the industry was eager to promote. In 1986, Warner Brothers dropped him. There was no final meeting or farewell call. According to Christopher, he learned he had been released only after reading a brief notice in a music industry magazine. Just 5 years earlier, he had become the first artist to win the 4 biggest Grammy Awards in one night. Now, he no longer had a major record deal. The revenge of the invisible hitmaker. The years after Warner Brothers dropped Christopher Cross were some of the hardest he had ever faced. He has spoken openly about living with anxiety, and as the pressure grew, he also struggled with alcohol. The fame was gone, the crowds became much smaller, and the man who had once stood on music's biggest stage was now performing in small venues, far from the spotlight he had once known. But Christopher never gave up on music. In 1989, he made one of the biggest decisions of his life and got sober. From there, he slowly began putting the pieces back together. He kept writing songs, recording new albums, and performing anywhere people wanted to hear him. The sold-out arenas were gone, but his love for music never disappeared. Instead, he built a different kind of career, performing in theaters, concert halls, and performing arts centers where people came for one reason: they genuinely loved his music. Then something happened that almost no one could have predicted. Years later, a younger generation began discovering artists like Christopher Cross through streaming services instead of television. They weren't choosing songs because of music videos or magazine covers. They were simply listening. And when they heard songs like Sailing, Ride Like the Wind, and Arthur's Theme, many realized just how timeless they really were. Today, Christopher Cross is in his 70s and still performs for audiences around the world. His music has been streamed hundreds of millions of times, reaching listeners who weren't even born when he first topped the charts. In many ways, the songs have outlived the era that once tried to leave them behind. Looking back, that's what makes his story so unforgettable. Christopher Cross didn't lose his talent. He didn't forget how to write songs, and he certainly didn't lose his voice. What changed was the business around him. The music industry entered a new chapter where image suddenly became just as important as the music itself. And Christopher happened to be caught right in the middle of this change. People still debate how much MTV affected his career, but few would argue that the arrival of music television changed the lives of countless artists almost overnight. Maybe that's why his story still feels so relevant today. It isn't only about Christopher Cross. It's about how quickly an industry can change and how easily someone at the very top can be left behind when the rules suddenly become different. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. Sometimes the most talented people don't disappear because they stop being great. Sometimes they disappear because the world starts paying attention to something else. It really makes you think. How many incredibly talented artists have quietly faded into the background, not because they lacked talent, but because they didn't fit the image the industry wanted to sell? And what about today? When you scroll through social media or watch today's biggest pop stars, are you connecting with them because of their music or because of the image that's been carefully built around them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.